everyone, April Dunham here. Today's video is all about Power Automate in SharePoint. This is actually a follow-up to a video I did a little bit while back when I showed you how to run a flow when a SharePoint item is modified. This is using the new Get Changes for an Item action with inside Power Automate. I got a lot of great feedback from you all on that video, and by far the most common question I got is how can I do this but also tell what the value was before it changed? So in this video, I'll show how we can take it a step farther and also go look at the previous version's values and get that so that we can pass that in to the actions within our workflow. I'll break it all down how it's done right after this. Let's walk through the use case first, then we'll show how to create the flow. So I'm using the Asset Manager Microsoft List template to track different assets that I have for my company. I want to receive an email notification when any of these statuses change from a status like in use, in repair, or reserved to available so that I know I can then check out and use that asset. So I might come into one of these items, go to edit and change the status to available, click save, and I'd like this to kick off a workflow and send me an email letting me know that the status has changed from in use to available. So I kick that off, I look at my email, and here it is telling me that the following asset status has changed from reserved to available. So now I can go and reserve that asset. So how does this work from the flow side of things? Well, let's open up this SP Get Changes flow in edit mode, and we'll walk through the process. 80% of this is going to be exactly the same as I showed in that Get Changes for a SharePoint item video that I did earlier, with just a couple of additions. So first thing that we want to do is make sure that we have the right trigger for this workflow. We're going to use the when an item or file is modified trigger. That's the only way that we can use that Get Changes for an item or file action, which allows us to determine if something has changed. So you'll make sure that you have that when a file or item trigger is initiated, and then you'll click on the site address, map that to the site address where your list is, and point that to the list that you want to trigger this off of. Then we'll go into add an action and do a search for that Get Changes action. That's the key to determining if a field has changed. So that's this Get Changes for an item or file properties only action. Same thing for this action, you'll point it to your site address and your list or library name. For the ID property, we'll use a dynamic content window and point that to the ID of your when an item or file is modified trigger. And finally, we need to fill in this since property. This tells the action when to get the changes since this particular date and time. So if we use our dynamic content again and search for the word trigger, we can use this trigger Windows start token property. This gets the time since the last flow check. So we need to understand what this Get Changes for an item or file action does for us. If we go look at one of the previous runs of the flow here and expand out that action, and look at its outputs, you can see that all it's doing is listing all of the columns that we have in our list, and it's outputting a true or false value. So I can see for the title field, that's false, meaning that nothing has changed since the last time in that particular field. But if I look at the status value, I can see that that is true, meaning that I have updated the status since the last version. Which brings me into another big key of how this is all working. In order to use this Get Changes for an item or file, you must have versioning enabled on your list or library. So to do that, you'll click on your gear, go to list settings, the versioning settings option, and you'll toggle this create version option to yes and specify the number of versions there that you want to keep. So without having that versioning property turned on, this action won't even work. That's how it's able to determine if something changed by comparing the versions. We're going to use this same version history capability to be able to then get the previous value of what it was before it changed. We can't use this Get Changes action because, as you see, it's not telling us what the values are. It's only giving us a true or false if the column is changed. So to do that, we need to click on our edit button here, go back to our flow, and you'll notice right below this Get Changes action, I have this send an HTTP request to SharePoint action. This is what will enable us to get the previous values so that we can use those in our workflow. And we have to use this one because the current Get Item action in the SharePoint connector for Power Automate does not let us specify getting a particular version of an item. So we have to make an HTTP call to the SharePoint REST API to be able to retrieve the details of a specific version of an item. So for this action, you'll do the same thing as far as pointing it to the site address where your list is stored. But the difference is going to be here in the method and URI. So for the method, we want to use the get method, meaning we're going to retrieve information from the API. And then for the URI, we need to post in our HTTP request here. And there's going to be two different properties that we need to pass into it. So we're going to do an underscore API /web/list, then /get by title. And in parentheses, you want to pass in the name of the SharePoint list that you're wanting to execute this on. So in my case, that list was called Asset Manager. So put that in single quotes and in parentheses after your get by title text. Then we're going to do a / and type the word items, and in parentheses there, that's where we want to pass in the item ID that we're executing this flow from, because that's the item we want to get the version history for. So if we just use our dynamic content, search for ID, we'll point it here to the when an item or file is modified, triggers ID property. And finally, now we need to get the version. So we're going to do a / versions, and in parentheses there, we're going to use our dynamic content window again and type in the word since. And we'll see that in our get changes for an item or file action that we have above, there's a property that it outputs called since version number. And that's what we want to put in there within the parentheses of our version section in our URI path. And that's everything we need to do for this particular action. Now let's take a look and see where that since version number is coming from. So if we go back again and look at a run history and expand out that get changes action again, and if we look at the outputs, you see we have two different properties we want to look at here. We have since version number and we have until version number. Since version number is what gets us the previous version number, and until version number is whatever the current version number is. So this is how the particular action is working to see if a column has changed. It's getting whatever the previous version number was, outputting that into this since version property, and what the current version is in the until version number, so that it can tell and compare if something has changed. So we can just leverage this since version number, which is the previous one, in our HTTP request to get the previous values. Now the last thing that we need to do is do some logic based off of what fields we're wanting to check on. So in my case, I only care about status, but if there's multiple fields you're wanting to check on, you can just duplicate this process I'm about to show on the individual field types. So we'll need to first do a check to see if our status column has changed. We'll use a condition for that. So we'll click on the plus button, add an action, and we'll add in this condition control. In the left-hand side, use your dynamic content and type status. We want this has column changed : status field. This is what outputs that true or false value. So we're going to do in our condition here an is equal to, and then in the right-hand side, we're going to use our expression window and type in the word true. So we're just saying if that column has changed, it equals true, then we want to do some additional logic. Now in our yes block here, if the column has changed, I'm going to use a compose action because now we need to actually get what that previous value was of the status field. Before we can figure out how to get that particular status column, we need to find out how that HTTP action is outputting the data that it returns. So what you want to do is run a test of your workflow so that you can get those flow runs like I was talking about. So if we go into the flow run history again on one of these items, and this time we'll expand out that send an HTTP request action, we want to examine the output and see what's happening. So I can tell that it's returning everything in this property called D, and then within that we have all of the fields from our list. So I can see the ID, the title, and if we scroll down, there's the status. So this will help us format the expression that we need to be able to return that value. So I'm just going to jump over to Visual Studio Code. I have this expression built already, and I'll explain what's happening. So what we want to do is we want to first reference the name of our send an HTTP request to SharePoint action. So we'll use the body property and then pass in the name of your action in single quotes there. Now this is the default name when you add in that action into your flow of what that will be. If for some reason you change it, or maybe you have multiple send and HTTP actions for some reason in your flow, that text might change. So you want to make sure that you update that to whatever it is in your flow. Then all we have to do is get down to the nested properties of that call. Now, remember why I pointed out that everything was wrapped in that D tag? So what we want to do here is after this body section, we want to have a square bracket and in single quotes, just the letter D. Then we want another section here after that with square brackets, and this is where you'll put in the name of the column or field that you want to return the value for, which in my case is status. So if you need to do this for multiple different columns and do the check and get the previous value, just swap this out with your column name and you're good to go. So I'm going to copy this. We'll go back to our flows edit mode. And in here in the yes bucket, I have a compose action. I like using these because it really helps from a troubleshooting perspective, especially when you're using a lot of expressions. Sometimes you have a mistype or whatever it might be and your expression doesn't work. It's much easier to tell what's going on if you're leveraging these compose actions and see what's happening in there rather than just doing it all directly, say, in the send email. So in the input property of this compose action, I'm going to click the expression tab. And we'll just paste in that value that we just looked at and click OK. Now to round this all up that we have that, I can just add in my send email action, which I have here. I'm just sending it to myself, and then in the body, you see this is where I'm actually going to reference my compose action output to get that value of the previous status. And then for the current status, all I'm doing is in the dynamic content, I did a search for status again, and we can leverage the status value from our trigger because that's going to be the current value. And really that's all there is to it. So we're going to click save and we'll do another test here just to make sure that everything's working. So we'll take a look at this iPhone, we'll go to edit mode and we'll change this status to available and click save, and this should kick off our workflow. All right, so if I check my email, there it is. I can see that the iPhone item has changed from reserved, that's the previous value, to available. And if we look at our run history, I can see 1 second ago, it ran, and here's where the compose action is very helpful. I can just expand that out and I can see that that's the previous value of the status there outputted in the compose action. I will include a link to download this flow in my GitHub so that you can reference that and the formula and the expressions used. And I'll put the expressions as well in the video notes so that you can just copy and paste those into your flows. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, do me a favor, click that thumbs up button and I'll catch you in the next video.